You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs. My guest today is Brian Grimm. He's the president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. He's the global chairman of Dare to Overcome. The website for reference is religiousfreedomandbusiness.org. So we're going to talk about his work with these organizations and what he does. Brian, thanks for coming.
It's great to be with you, Richard.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit of a background on yourself, and then we'll get into your current work.
Yeah, well, I've had a very diverse background. I worked overseas beginning in 1982, worked in the People's Republic of China, mostly in the Western region in Xinjiang. Four of my kids were born there in the 1980s. And then I worked in the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. Through the 1990s, worked in the Middle East, and then came back to the U.S. when my kids went to college and did a PhD and studied quantitative sociology and ended up measuring how governments and societies restrict people's free practice to believe or even not believe in a faith or a religion.
Oh, well, were you observing it in the 80s when you were in China and when you were also in Russia? Or is it now that it's far worse or different, or what's your observation?
Well, it's different. So in terms of religious freedom in the 1970s, 1980s, surely the biggest threats to, people's freedom to follow a faith, have a faith, change their faith, or have no faith at all was the actions of governments, and particularly communist governments were, devoted in some ways to eradicating religion. As Marx said, religion's the opiate of the people. It sort of drugs them into a lack of awareness of reality, was the communist perspective. So they had a mission, to dispel people of these, what they considered myths and false ideas. And so that was really the greatest challenge. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberalization of many former communist countries, then the threats to religious freedom changed to being more a non-state actors, and especially with the events of September 11th, 2001, 9/11, where you had some guys more or less, living out in the middle of nowhere who orchestrated, a massive attack. And then that led to a number of things, including the Arab Spring and other movements that really triggered not just Al-Qaeda, but other groups like ISIS. And then for those years, that was really the greatest threat coming from groups in society. And sort of my research has been to look at the connection between the two when you have high government restrictions on religion or belief, and then high social hostilities towards people of different beliefs than, say, the society. And those two work in tandem to lead to violence and conflict. So, and then looking at today, one of the greatest challenges is the rise of religious nationalism and other forms of, nationalism. Then defines a country or a region by a particular faith, to the extent that those who, have a different view are even viewed as traitors or not loyal. So that's a growing threat today. But communism's still there, especially with China, and it's continuing to seek to export its model of how society should be run, where the Communist Party is the one that decides, really everything for how a society can work. And really, religion continues to be viewed not just as a wrong thinking, but dangerous thinking. So in China, it's viewed as a threat to national security. So, the challenges continue. They change from time to time. And so I've been observing that, from the inside and, in different countries, as well as studying it.
So you mentioned religious nationalism. What is that? And you're saying it's a problem, or what's the situation with it? What is it?
Well, yeah. So it's sort of religious nationalism is when you sort of define your country as this country is a Christian country, this country's a Muslim country, this country's a Hindu country or Buddhist country or atheist country. So defining by a belief to such an extent that those who have a different belief than the one that you think the country should be following are viewed as unwelcome or viewed as a nuisance or viewed in some way that's less than equal. So that the nationalism rises generally when sort of politics whips it up into viewing their, your life, your identity is under threat. And then, rallying people around that cause. So, sort of nationalism often rises in an atmosphere where the politics are trying to, garner support. So it's not generally something that rises, you would say, out of your local church or mosque or synagogue or temple, but it tends to be some leader who's sort of whipping up people into support, and religion becomes one of those things that he or she gets people to rally around.
Yeah, I've heard like in India, the Hindu nationalists and Narendra Modi is, I guess, promoting Hindu nationalism, and they may be pushing, more heavily on the Muslims lately. What have you seen?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in India, and India is, one of the most religiously diverse countries, and historically it's been, it has a long history where religion's been, part of it in various ways. Muslims ruled the country before it was the current India for centuries, and then coming out of that, once they were no longer in the rule, still Hindus are the large, vast majority. So the sort of the politics in India, religion, you could say culture, and is all part of that. And so, there's a sense, and you have to look at what happened after the British relinquished control in India and they gained their independence. There was a debate, should we just have two separate countries, one for the Muslims and one for Hindus, and then there are other minorities like Christians and Baha'is and Jains and Zoroastrians, known as Parsis, and others, Sikhs, of course. But in the end, Gandhi and Nehru wanted to keep India together for everyone, but then sort of head of the Muslim League, he wanted to have a separate country, so he convinced the British to have a Pakistan for Muslims and then an India for everybody that didn't want to be part of Pakistan, so to speak. But that led to a partition, and more than 1 million people were killed as they tried to switch borders and all that. So, religion is just really part of the history and part of, what even formed current day India. So in that process, Pakistan defined itself as an Islamist nation or a Muslim nation, but India has a secular constitution where they're looking to define themselves as a country for everyone, and every group has a place. So if you look at the rhetoric, you hear both things, okay, Pakistan got to be Muslim. How come we can't make India Hindu? Doesn't that sound fair? So you hear that, but at the same time, but it's still India's for everybody. And, we want to make sure everyone's included. So you'll hear, different versions of that, even from the same person. And, it's evolving thought, and it's not clear how it's all going to turn out. It's a very live issue.
I saw in your bio that there was a mention of that religion actually adds to the economy. It has its own GDP, essentially. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, when you look at religion, it's something that you think, well, how could you measure its economic input? It's like trying to measure the value of love. Well, when a few years ago when my daughter got married and her then fiance had to buy a ring, and then there was a wedding and reception and wedding dresses and people coming from out of town. And, you can't really measure love, but you can measure the results of it. And, now they have 4 kids, and, that love resulted in joy, but also, a lot more expense. And so you can measure those kind of things. So in that way, I've been able to measure sort of the impact of religion and its institutions, its social goods that it produces. So I've measured it that way. And then there's the other side is when you look at religious freedom, broadly defined, and you measure that, then you can see how that correlates with other things like sustainable development and other goods for society. So like in the U.S., when we did a national measurement of the economic contribution of religion, we looked at three things. One is activities of congregations, and that adds about $400 billion of economic activity in the U.S. every year. We've done studies and also in Canada found similar results, though lesser numbers. So if you think of that number, where does all that money come from or go to? Well, church buildings, synagogues, temples, mosques, all of that takes money to build them and maintain them and pay for electricity and lighting. And so all of that's finance that is going into the economy. You hire people and that's going into the economy. You pay somebody to plow the snow, that's going into the economy. But then in addition to that, it's services provided. Many congregations, provide addiction recovery groups, whether it's through Alcoholics Anonymous or other programs. Many denominations even have their own sort of 12-step type programs. And, all of that, you can measure how many lives are saved each year that are, don't end up either having committed an overdose or ending up being institutionalized. So, you start measuring those things and, that comes up to more than $400 billion a year. And then religious institutions, whether it's, Brandeis University, which is a Jewish related school, or Baylor University, which is Baptist, or the Catholic University of America, of course, is Catholic. So all of these institutions, whether it's education, healthcare, like 1 in 6 people who goes to a hospital in the U.S. is seen in a Catholic hospital. So all of that's economic activity. And then the last category we look at is faith-related business. So like the Knights of Columbus, they're a fraternal order within the Catholic Church, but they have $100 billion worth of life insurance in effect. So it's a business. And other companies, like some that you may have heard of, are like Hobby Lobby. They had a Supreme Court case that the Supreme Court recognized that they do have a faith-based identity, and it's as a company, the owners are Christian and they look at their company as a Christian, or others, even publicly traded companies like Coca-Cola Consolidated, the largest bottlers of Coke. Part of their mission is to glorify God. And, they have faith-based sort of leadership mentoring in the company. So, that adds another sort of third bucket of religious impact and measuring it. So that all comes up to about $1.2 trillion a year, which would make religion, if it were its own country, religion in the U.S., it would be like 15th largest national economy in the world, bigger than, 180 other countries in terms of GDP. So it's
that's amazing.
Yeah, so it's not like, that religion has all that money in the bank and it's just sitting there, but it's all being used to serve congregations, but also the wider public. You don't have to belong to the church to attend an AA meeting, in the church basement. It's these churches are not just clubs for the members, but actively reaching out to the community.
Well, you're the first person to establish this monetary factor for religion, and when you saw the figure, were you surprised?
Well, no one had ever done a national number like that before. Others had been, and really this work built on the research of others, including someone from University of Pennsylvania by the name of Ram Kannan, and he had been looking at and quantifying the economic impact of congregations in Philadelphia, and then he did a number of other cities. So, people were working on this, but no one had ever tried to pull it all together and look at all the different factors and not just congregations. So this really was the first time. And in terms of surprise at the number, I can say that I'll give an example. The Guardian newspaper from the UK, which is the 5th largest newspaper in terms of not circulation, but measured by website visits in the world. They did a story when our research came out, and they had, I forget, was 19,000 shares of the story. Not just 19,000 views, but millions of views. And in comparison, just to see how surprising that story was, that our research came out the same year that Donald Trump was elected president, which was surprising there were few that were predicting he would beat Hillary Clinton. It was an unexpected result. And when that story headline came out on The Guardian, that story was shared only 17,000 times. So you could say that religion, matters in terms of money and contribution was more surprising to people than Donald Trump was elected president, which was, not an expected result either.
Well, once you did this calculation, what can you do with that? What new light does it shed on the role of religion? And do governments know about this? Have you been able to advise them so that they see it as an interesting source of productivity in the economy?
Yeah, I think what it does is it helps people who might be skeptical of the value of religion, because a growing number of people in the United States and Europe and Western countries are growing up in families that are religiously unaffiliated, and so you have not just people who are religiously unaffiliated, but now whole families are, and then they, their kids never go to Sunday school or, experience bar mitzvah or, whatever the religious tradition is. So, for those people, it's like, well, why does religious freedom matter? Why would religion be a protected category? In Title VII, we have different categories of people, their race, their heritage, their gender, different things are protected by law so that you can't discriminate against them. And people say, well, why religion? Because headlines, in most newspapers, what do they report? Well, it's not news that, a priest or a clergy person, helps somebody who's down and out or, helps somebody who's suffering. That's not news. But if a clergy person, does something illegal of some sort, well, then that's news. And so the news is often reporting, if you look at the news, you get a distorted picture of religion. You only hear the bad things. And if you're not religiously active, that might be your whole view of religion. So I think by quantifying the positive economic contribution religion makes, and then what that means in terms of, goods and services, such as, I think, I forget the exact number, but something like 7 times more people go to a religious, like a church or, synagogue, a cathedral. They go to a religious house of worship to view arts and architecture. 7 times more people do that than go to museums in the U.S. on an annual basis. So right there, religious buildings are a source of, national enrichment that many people access and use them, to enrich their lives through art. And, those kind of findings, if you're not religious, you might think, well, what's the value of it all? Why do we give religious organizations a tax break? And, why do we give special protections to people who are of faith and all of that? So I think it sheds light on the value of religion for people who don't experience it.
Yeah, very interesting. What other research are you undertaking right now, or what are you looking into at this moment? What are some questions?
Well, really one of the most exciting things that we're working on is that we have an annual index that measures corporate religious equity, diversity, and inclusion, or we call it the READY Index. And so, like in this diversity, and then, with the recent Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action, all these, diversity commitments are in the news, and people are sort of looking at that. And one of the, one reason among some people that diversity has a bad name is it's focused on certain aspects of diversity, but not all of them, including religion. And, religion is just, like I mentioned, it is just as protected under Title VII as the other characteristics, including sexual orientation, sex, gender, race, etc. So, why haven't corporations paid as much attention to that? And I had an article at the World Economic Forum on, why aren't corporations doing this? And so we set out to measure the Fortune 500 and how they're doing. And we've just released in May the 4th annual index. And what we found is that the majority of companies haven't included religion as part of their diversity, but some of the biggest and best companies in the world do. Google and Texas Instruments, American Express, American Airlines, PayPal, a company called Equinix, Target even has included religion as part of their diversity commitments. And so that's what we're measuring. And we're seeing these companies, once you measure it, then, they want to compete to do the best. So Intel is the most faith-friendly company this year, according to the index. Last year was American Airlines, and the year before it was Intel, and the first year was Google. So, these companies in a good-hearted spirit compete to, want to show off that, we are a faith-inclusive faith and belief, not just religious belief, but even atheists and agnostics are part of this inclusion so that people can feel like they can bring their whole soul to work, not just their whole self to work and their whole spirit, and whatever that might be for people. So that, I think that, that ongoing research is, we initially did it just by looking at publicly information available from the companies, but now companies are opting in and completing a survey each year, and then the companies that don't, we can still assess them externally. So, I think that's having a lot of good, it's interesting research, but it's also, helping to stimulate companies to address this imbalance where certain categories are covered in diversity, but others aren't. And then it's also getting attention internationally.
What do you mean?
So this, for the first time, we had, in addition to the U.S. Fortune 500, we had companies from the Global 500, such as Accenture, Bosch, SAP, opting in to participate in the index. And then we had some Europe-only companies, such as TPAC, that's the yoga tea company, one of the largest independent tea manufacturers in the world. Also had OVO Energy, one of the large energy companies in Britain, and another British company. And in fact, this got the attention of 10 Downing Street and the UK Treasury. So we're having a meeting actually next week with ministers from, it was supposed to be held at 10 Downing Street, but just yesterday, Joe Biden announced he's visiting UK, and we were going to have this meeting at 10 Downing Street in their state dining room to bring corporate leaders together with some of the ministers from the government. But that room's been reallocated for Joe Biden's visit. So we'll probably hold it in the Treasury Department. But it's, the government there is interested to learn more about this. C-suite people from some of the top companies there, like Rolls-Royce, which is one of the most faith-friendly companies in the UK, Aviva, a large insurance company, plus the international companies. Google will participate in the meeting, Salesforce, American Express, and others. So, we're looking at, and we'll have a conference in November 20th hosted at Salesforce Tower in London, where we bring all these companies together. And we're doing the same thing in India, where we're bringing together companies that are, seeing how faith is and belief and culture is part of the rich diversity, which makes their company strong. So it's a very positive story because, if you think of, just globally, I'll give one example from Intel. So one of their guys from Costa Rica, from the Intel group in Costa Rica, got assigned a project to lead a project in Muslim majority Malaysia. And he had never even met Muslims, yet how am I going to work in that culture? And then Intel has these employee resource groups that are set up people of faith. So they company sponsored, but employee-led groups. And head of the Christian group, this guy was asking, how am I going to do this? He said, oh, I know Hadi Sharifi. He's that a Muslim group. I bet you he'd help out. And then just informally, Hadi started coaching the guy from Costa Rica, resulting in business success. And there was just recently a Wall Street Journal article reporting on all this. And, the reporter wanted to just verify that story was true. And we reached out to Hadi, and he said, oh, yeah, after that, I'm just, it just continues. I'm just helping people, navigate, if they've got work in the Muslim areas, helping them, work towards business success. So, when companies open their door to faith and people don't have to hide it, then you have resources such as I've just described, that you can help each other understand what it means to work in a Muslim majority country, or a Hindu majority company, or Christian majority company, or Jewish. There's only one in Israel, but like Salesforce, their group is called Faith Force, In Israel, they have a special program, employee recruitment program, where they reach out to the the economically depressed communities and get them to get on track to get trained to do jobs as part of their work in Salesforce in Israel. And they particularly reach out to Arabs, Arab Israelis, and ultra-Orthodox Israelis, both of whom have lower education. Like the ultra-Orthodox tend to not go to the schools beyond the religious school or go to college, and especially the women that don't get education at the same level as others in Israel, and the same with some of the Arab populations, Arab Israelis. And they recruit them, and then they put them together, in teams to work together. And the result is, in this country that is often struggling with how to get the different faiths to work together, right in the company, they're bringing that together. So it's not that it not only helps the company, but when a company can address some of these religious dynamics, you can help the country and the culture that you're working in.
Has anyone advised anyone or give guidelines, or their workshops for facilitating conversations between, religious groups and non-religious groups, etc.? Or is it just being studied to see what's out there and whatever happens?
You mean within companies?
Yeah, within companies, to have dialogues with, their different employees and contractors that are religious, non-religious, have this idea, that idea, from this background, that background.
Yeah. Well,
how much of that is going on for all sub, I hear a lot about, we have this policy of diversity, or we have this policy of this or that. But again, is there much instruction, or is it, just be aware of this and make sure you do it right without any guidance?
Yeah, well, once a company decides to include religion as an okay thing in the company, however that's manifested. So it like in Tyson Foods, they have a commitment to the spiritual care of every person in the company, and they hire chaplains, full-time chaplains, on staff of different faiths and backgrounds to provide a ministry of presence, compassionate care to all their employees. So then they're doing what some people think HR did years ago, sort of care for the people. Now HR is mostly managing, all the policies and all that. So when you have a sort of faith-friendly component, it might be chaplains. And AZZ, which is the largest metal galvanizing company in the U.S., they have a chaplain program as well, and they credit them to having saved the company during the pandemic, because everybody in that industry were considered essential workers. The guys people out on the shop floor, and when they hear essential worker, they hear expendable worker. Because they don't care about our health, but the white collar people can work remotely. But no, they had chaplains right on the floor, just there to work with them, hear what's going on, the problems they're having, the family problems, whatever the issues. And so that faith friendliness actually provides people with resources to help people and interact with people. So that's one way it manifests. But these employee resource groups, whether it's an interfaith group or faith-based groups within the company, that provides channels for programming. So like at Dell Technologies, their interfaith employee group, they developed, sort of fact-based information on different faiths and what you should know about your, Muslim neighbor who's working, your Muslim colleague, what challenges do they face in the workplace, or a Christian colleague or a Jewish colleague, what does Ramadan mean? And what's this fasting all about? And when is it? And so, they help inform, educate within the companies. But sort of the bigger thing is that it gives an official voice for people in the company. So like at Google, when they, before 5-6 years ago, Google was, a no religion zone. We don't do religion. But once they started their Inner Belief Network, which has 10,000 or more members around the world, then they gave an official voice so that, when people want to block their calendar if you're a Muslim and pray on Friday, well, now that policy says you can do that. Before they couldn't. Or, the Google bars, their food courts and the headquarters and their big offices, before they didn't have halal or kosher food. And so that meant, like if you want to keep kosher, you can't eat with your colleagues where a lot of work ideas happen. So, then they were able to change those policies. Or even on the issues like, there's different issues that come up where, some state or city is enacting some policy and the people want to say, well, let's boycott that place. But, it may be that policy is something people of faith like. And so you can have a voice within the company to say, hey, we actually see it. We see that social issue differently and you might want to take us into account. And so, all those things help to make religion not a taboo topic, but one that can be discussed and discussed intelligently.
I know the treatment can't be 100% evenly applied or even close. Do you see that pretty good attempts are being made, or do you see that it's very lopsided in its application where certain groups are being treated more preferentially than others? Like, what's your overall observation? I know it's different everywhere, but what do you see?
Well, I think that when it's in terms of, sort of diversity, what it's trying to do is make sure everybody feels included, that everybody belongs. That's one way to look at diversity programs. And so if that's the perspective, then maybe there's a group that really is being excluded. So like, even if you take religion, for example, certain religious groups have problems that others don't, especially those who have a visible manifestation of their faith. Like Sikhs wear a turban. Many of the men do. And, like after 9/11, a lot of Sikhs were mistaken for Muslims and they received a lot of abuse. And people see somebody with a turban and it's like, they wonder about that and they might have attitudes about that. So it would be right to have some special awareness training about what is a Sikh and, why do they wear a turban and, what are the fundamentals of their belief, just to dispel misconceptions about them. So that's sort of, what in their best approaches diversity tries to do is, who might be misunderstood or might be left out of our company because of that. Or you can even think of, keeping on the topic of religion, join us for happy hour, and a lot of business gets done there. Well, what about members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who don't drink? Many Baptists don't drink. Muslims in general don't drink. And, that's going to exclude them. So, I think what the diversity is trying to do is say, well, let's understand each other to make sure that we're not doing things that unintentionally exclude. So, sometimes, the group that's being excluded might be characterized by race or gender or sexual orientation or other characteristics. So I think it's always a balance. You're always looking to make sure everyone's included in that. But religion has been the last big category to start being added. And so I think there's a lot of work to go there, but some of these big companies are really, leaning into this in very positive ways.
Very good. Well, Brian, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? It sounds like you've been involved in a lot of groups, a lot of organizations. You're always moving. How can people follow you and see what you're doing?
Well, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. That's, we engage a lot there. You mentioned our website, religiousfreedomandbusiness.org. Also, a shortcut to that is faithandbusiness.org. Those are ways you can connect with us. And, we're always glad to provide, if there are companies out there, if you haven't gotten into this space, we can provide training. We have hundreds and hundreds of videos on our website of companies sharing their story. And that's often the best way for this to spread how it spreads from one company to another. And that's one thing we love to do is connect companies, with companies who are already doing this and they can learn how.
Well, very good. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.